to be doing some creepypasta and some Reddit stories. To begin, we're going to be doing a story from creepypasta called Biting at My Heels, written by Colin Entman. So we begin. I enjoy running quite a bit. It might come off as a bit odd to say, but it really is important to me. I found my love for it back in high school, when I ended up drifting aimlessly onto the cross-country track team. Joining was way less of an act of choice on my part and more of a settling. My parents wanted me to be more like my football and academic all-star brother, and I just wanted them off my back. Running seemed like the easiest choice. It was less of a skill-based sport and more of a test of endurance, which is something I thought I had plenty of. Given all the 4-hour-long lectures I've sat through, of course, it wasn't easy like I thought it would be. Much like any sport, it required a lot of dedication and hard work. Blood, sweat, and tears, and all that jazz. Even my general attitude towards life at that time. Most would expect that to put me off, but surprisingly it didn't. I loved it. It was less about racing, competing, and all that, and more about the simple act of running. Of just getting out there and moving your body. It was really hard at first, when you have to build up your stamina and become capable of running long distances. However, the feeling of your body improving, of becoming able to go further for longer, is very satisfying. Plus, just having that ability to run miles and miles is incredibly freeing in a way. Something about being able to travel without relying on anything but yourself was a very positive factor in building up my self-worth. Having a more dependable body made me feel like a more reliable, complete person. By the time graduation came around, it was part of my identity. If there was one part of it that I wasn't particularly fond of, it'd be the occasional nasty weather. And particularly, timing a run outdoors during the summer can be a bit of a pain. When it comes to spring or fall, you can pretty much go out for a run whenever. For winter, it's less about timing and more about conditions. You can always bundle up a bit to keep the cold at bay, but whether or not your surfaces will be icy or under thick layers of snow is definitely something to be concerned about. However, in no season are your windows for going out for a run more limited than during the summer months. If you live in an area where you have comparatively mild summers, this may not be the case for you. However, if you live in an area where the temperatures often go above 100 degrees, and death from heat stroke is a common occurrence, then you'll probably be able to relate. In weather like that, if you want to manage a run outside, you either need to do it in the early morning or late evening, or just find a decently shady area and hope for the best. Sure, you could just go out to an air-conditioned gym and run on a treadmill, but it just isn't quite the same, you know? Thankfully, when it came time for college, I ended up at one with a beautiful campus and with extensive jogging and biking paths, which were in a well-shaded forested area. On top of that, my schedule ended up organized in such a way that I had plenty of time free in the mornings and evenings on most days. Overall, I was in pretty good shape to be able to run outside in any season, even in the hottest days of summer. If it weren't for what happened that one day, it would have been perfect. It was a bit late getting out of the dorm for my run that evening. I had to meet with my professor after class to go over my plan for the final project. The meeting ended up running a bit late. It was getting close to sunset by the time I got back from class and finished changing into my workout gear. But I decided to go out on a run anyways. Missing a day was a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and I figured that if I ran quickly enough, I'd be able to make it back before the sun set completely. I was right about that. I did manage to get back before the sun finished dipping below the horizon. However, there was one thing that I neglected to factor in. That, in dense woods, it would start to get really dark long before the sun set completely. I was about halfway through the last leg of my 6-mile loop when it was really starting to set in. I could barely see my own feet in the pavement, let alone the path ahead. It was then I realized my mistake. However, I was well beyond being able to do much of anything about it. I was about 1.5 miles away from getting back to the relatively well-lit campus, but it wasn't like there was a way for me to cut the run short at that point. I was already on the quickest road way back. The most I could do was run a bit faster. Sighing, I picked up my pace a bit, hoping that I could make it back to campus before I lost all traces of light. I wished that I hadn't left all my devices at home and opted to enjoy the sounds of nature rather than music. At least I could have had something to light my path. Unfortunately, I didn't quite make it. When I was still about 1/2 mile out, the forest had finally become pitch black, without even the light of the moon piercing through the thick canopy. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. I didn't really mind it so much, though it did feel a bit unnerving. But running without sight was also a sort of fun, new experience. Sort of like showering with the bathroom lights off. Sure, running the dock with dark was a lot riskier in comparison. The maintenance staff did a good job of keeping the trails clear, so I was in little danger of tripping. Also, at that point, it was pretty much a straight shot to campus. I felt relatively safe. That is, until I wasn't. It came up on me as sort of feeling, a general sense of something being amiss. I was more or less certain that it wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me. All the same, though, I certainly wasn't having fun anymore. 0.4 miles left. I found myself shivering a bit, and not because of the cold. I found myself thinking back on the time I wet myself in a haunted house of 5 years old. The pure sense of fear that I felt back then in that moment seemed deeply similar to what was presently creeping up my spine as I ran through those woods. The rapid beating of my heart, already quickened by the exercise, pushed fearful adrenaline through my system even quicker. I picked up the pace. 0.3 miles left. I almost couldn't hear the sound of the branch snapping over the pounding of my heart and rush of my breath. It came from somewhere off in the woods behind me and to my left. It was a perfectly normal sound to hear in the woods, completely innocent, probably just a small animal under the brush. However, as anxiety-ridden as I was in that moment, it may have well been a gunshot. Reason was leaking rapidly from my mind. I felt certain that whatever had made the noise was coming from me. I was running full tilt now. 0.2 miles left. For once, it was just the rhythmic smacking of my sneakers against the pavement. Suddenly, there was an accompaniment. It seemed that whoever or whatever was behind me was trying to match my pace as best as they could, but it was ever so slightly offbeat. The sound seemed to be getting closer. I broke into a dead sprint. So did they, dropping any presence of stealth. 0.1 miles. I could see the exit where the last of the trees parted, giving way to the well-manicured lawns of the campus grounds. It was so very close, a distance I could cover in less than a minute at light jog. I couldn't take much comfort in that, though. Whatever was chasing me was right at my heels. They were so close that they might as well be able to reach out and touch me. With this proximity, I started to notice things. Little details that seemed only terrifying me further. The scrape of claws against the pavement with every step. The wet stench of rotting meat. A breath of hot air that coated my back and a vile humidity. It was just a few more strides away from escape, but those last steps might as well have been a marathon. I felt like a rabbit, desperately trying to outpace a set of ravenous jaws. It was so close. 3 steps. 2. 1. I broke free of the woods, losing my balance and stumbling off the path, and into the grass as I went, stunned. It took me a few moments before I scrambled to my feet, fearful of whatever had been chasing me, following me into the light. There was nothing there. Nothing but pitch black entrance to the trails. The way the light hit the trees made it seem almost like a dark tunnel leading into the depth of a mountain, or the great gaping maw of some massive beast. Intimidating, yet harmless. Whatever had been chasing me was gone. Perhaps it was never even there. I stumbled to my feet out of breath, yet full of relief. I chuckled a bit to myself and glanced about, thankful to find that no one was around to catch sight of my foolishness. Having fully convinced myself that I had simply imagined the whole thing, I headed off towards my dorm at the limping jog. I felt like I had pulled a calf muscle during my tumble. It wasn't until I got back to my dorm and started stripping down for a shower that I saw them. A series of small incisions on my right calf, arranged in the shape of a semicircle. They were about 1 inch deep and still losing blood. It almost as if I had been bitten by a small shark with a mouth full of razor blades. With that incident, in addition to the several different appearances that occurred out of the woods over the next few years, I was pretty much done with running on those trails. I stuck to using the treadmills at the school gym for the rest of my time at college, even during the daylight. Just felt safer that way. And that is the end of that story. This next one comes from Reddit. Let's see what we've got. Why is the randomizer never working? Anyways. Let's see. Okay. This one comes from Reddit in the Let's Not Meet subreddit. This one is by Lucia Gray. twice, and it was posted 19 days ago. This is supposed to be a true story. So let's get to it. For some background, there's an app called Life 360 where you can add your friends, family, and essentially you can all see each other's current and past locations. You can set alerts to be notified when somebody comes home or leaves, arrives at work, etc. It's really good, and I recommend it to everyone. You can never be too safe nowadays. 2 months ago, I was home, waiting for my boyfriend to get home. I got an alert at around 1800, letting me know that he had left work. It usually took him around 45 minutes to get home. I got up from the sofa, head upstairs, and ran myself a bath. The bath was ready in about 10 minutes, and I was doing other bits as I waited for it to cool when I heard a thud downstairs. And through the closed bathroom door, I assumed the front door, I shouted something along the lines of, "I'm taking a bath." I heard him walking along our very creaky floorboards and assumed he was in the kitchen grabbing some dinner. It was about 5 minutes later when I picked up my phone to put on some music and realized I had never gotten an alert from my phone from Life 360 saying my boyfriend arrived home. So I went into the app to make sure I didn't miss it. And I kid you not, my blood ran cold when I saw that he had stopped at a petrol station and was still about half an hour away. I could still hear the floorboards creak downstairs, very lightly, as if somebody but was unable. I had no idea what to do. I called my boyfriend, but he did not answer. And when I didn't hear his phone ring from downstairs, I freaked out even more. I have horrible anxiety, and I could feel an attack coming on. I left the bathroom and walked into the bedroom as quietly as possible. I shoved my desk chair under the knob as it didn't have a lock. I don't know why, but I didn't think to call the police then. I was so focused on getting out that all my other thoughts and senses disappeared. I say this lightly now, but this was not the case in the moment. I proceeded to basically Mission Impossible it out of the bathroom. We had a shed under that window, large enough for me to get safely on top of, then jump off from it into the garden. The only issue was that I had to make my way down the garden alley, where I would have to walk past the large window and door, where he would be able to see me very clearly. I was so scared. I kept taking peeks into the window and couldn't see anyone. I felt more confident to run past. Took one last peek, and he was there, looking right at me. Not even a footstep away from the window. I cannot even begin to explain the sheer fear and horror I felt. Looking him right in the eyes, he had such a cold expression, totally emotionless. I ran, didn't look back. I was so fucking terrified. I remember nearly tripping in my slippers and having to shake them off so I could run faster. There's a long road between us and our neighbors where I was running to. I did make it. Their lights were on, and I started pounding on the windows. I was let in, and they called the police for me, as I was inconsolable at that point. I kept telling them, "Please call my boyfriend," as he was driving home too. When the police arrived, they found no one was there. We didn't have cameras, and neither did my neighbors, so we had no way of telling when or how he entered and left. Later, I found out he came through the window. The noise I heard, which I assumed was the door, was actually the window that fell downwards and shut loudly. After I assumed the man came in, there were also some scratches on the top of the chair that I put on the doorknob, signaling he tried to open, but was unable to. There wasn't much of a case. I couldn't ID him, as he was wearing a face mask and a beanie. I don't even know what color hair he had, only that he was white, tall, slim, and a man. I only looked right at him for a mere second, if that. Nothing was stolen either. We have cameras and security systems now, never making that mistake again. And now, we move back to creepypasta. This is a story called Bedtime. Part 1. The Beginning. Bedtime is supposed to be a happy event for a tired child. For me, it was terrifying. While some children might complain about being put to bed before they had finished watching a film or playing their favorite video game, when I was a child, nighttime was something to truly fear. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it still is. As someone who is trained in science, I cannot prove that what had happened to me was objectively real, but I can swear that what I experienced was genuine horror. A fear which in my life, I'm glad to say, has never been equaled. I will relate it to you all now as best as I can. Make of it what you will, but I'll be glad just to get it off my chest. I can't remember exactly when it started, but my apprehension towards falling asleep seemed to correspond with me being moved into a room of my own. I was 8 years old at the time, and until then I had shared a room quite happily with my older brother, as is perfectly understandable for a boy 5 years of my senior. My brother eventually wished for a room of his own, and as a result, I was given the room at the back of the house. It was small, narrow, yet oddly elongated room, large enough for a bed and a couple of chests of drawers, but not much else. I couldn't really complain because even at that age, I understood that we did not have a large house, and I had no real cause to be disappointed, as my family was both loving and caring. It was a happy childhood during the day. A solitary window looked out into the back garden. Nothing out of the ordinary. But even during the day, the light which crept into the room seemed almost hesitant. My brother was given a new bed. I was given the bunk airbeds, which we used to share. While I was as upset about sleeping on my own, I was excited at the thought of being able to sleep on the top bunk, which seemed far more adventurous to me. From the very first night, I remembered a strange feeling of unease creeping slowly from the back of my mind. I lay on the top bunk, staring down at my action figures and a car strewn across the green and blue carpet. As imaginary battles and adventures took place between the toys on the floor, I couldn't help but feel that my eyes were being slowly drawn towards the bottom bunk, as if something was moving in the corner of my eye, something which did not wish to be seen. The bunk was empty, impeccably made with a dark blue blanket tucked in neatly, partially covering rather two bland white pillows. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was a child, and the noise slipping under my door from my parents' as television bathed me in a warm sense of safety and well-being. I fell asleep. When you awake from a deep sleep to something moving or stirring, it can take a few minutes for you to truly understand what is happening. The fog of sleep hangs over your eyes and ears even when lucid. Something was moving. There was no doubt about that. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Everything was dark, almost pitch black, but there was enough light creeping in from the outside to outline that narrowly suffocating room. Two thoughts appeared in my mind almost simultaneously. First was that my parents were in bed because the rest of the house lay both in darkness and silence. The second thought turned into the noise, a noise which had obviously woken me. As the cobwebs of sleep withered from my mind, the noise took on a more familiar form. Something the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. A cold wind whistling through a tree outside. A neighbor's footsteps uncomfortably close. Or, in this case, the simple sound of bed sheets rustling in the dark. That was it. Bed sheets rustling in the dark as if some disturbed sleeper was attempting to get all too comfortable in the bottom bunk. I lay there in disbelief that the noise was either my imagination or perhaps just my pet cat finding somewhere comfortable to spend the night. It was then that I noticed my door shut as it had been when I fell asleep. Perhaps my mom had checked on me and the cat had sneaked into my room then. Yes, that must have been it. I turned to face the wall, closing my eyes in vain, hoping I could fall back to sleep. As I moved, the rustling noise from underneath me ceased. I thought I must have disturbed my cat, but I quickly realized the visitor in the bottom bunk was much less mundane than my pet cat trying to sleep, and much more sinister. As if it started to be alert and disgruntled by my presence, the disturbed sleeper began to toss and turn violently, like a child having a temper in their bed. I could hear the sheets twist and turn with increasing ferocity. Fear then gripped me, not like the subtle sense of unease I had experienced earlier, now more potent and terrifying. My heart raced as my eyes panicked, scanning the almost impenetrable darkness. I let out a cry, as most young boys do. I instinctively shouted my mother. I could hear something stir on the other side of the house. But as I began to breathe a sigh of relief that my parents were coming to save me, the bunk beds started to shake violently, as if gripped by an earthquake, scraping against the wall. I could hear the sheets below me thrashing, as if tormented by malice. I did not want to jump down to safety, as I feared the thing in the bottom bunk would reach out and grab me, pulling me into the darkness. So I stayed there, white knuckles clenched my blanket as a shroud of protection. The weight seemed like an eternity visitor lay empty and peaceful. I cried and my mother consoled me. Tears of fear, followed by relief, streamed down my face. Yet through all the horror and relief, I did not tell her why I was upset. I could not explain it, but it was as if though whatever had been in the bunk would return if I had even so much as spoke of it, or uttered a single syllabus of its existence. Whether that was the truth, I do not know, but as a child I felt as if that unseen menace remained close, listening. My mother lay in the empty bunk, promising to stay there till morning. Eventually, my anxiety diminished. Tiredness pushed me back towards sleep, but I remained restless, waking several times momentarily to the sound of rustling bedsheets. I remember the next day wanting to go anywhere, be anywhere, but in that narrow, suffocating room. It was a Saturday, and I played outside quite happily with my friends. Although our house was not large, we were lucky to have a long, sloped garden in the back. We played there often, as much of it was overgrown, and we could hide in the bushes, climb in the huge sycamore tree, which towered above all else, and easily imagine ourselves in the throes of a grand adventure in some untamed, exotic land. As fun as it all was, occasionally my eyes would turn to that small window, ordinarily a sight and inconspicuous. But for me, that thin boundary was a looking glass into a strange, cold pocket of dread outside the lush green surroundings of our garden, filled with the smiling faces of my friends. I could not extinguish the creepy feeling crawling its way up my spine. Each hair standing on end, the feeling of something in that room, watching me play, waiting for the night when I would be alone, eagerly filled with hate. It may sound strange to you, but by the time my parents ushered me back into that room for the night, I said nothing. I did not protest. I didn't even make an excuse as to why I couldn't sleep there. I simply, sullenly walked into that room, climbed the few steps into the top bunk, and then waited. As an adult, I would be telling everyone about my experience. But even at that age, I felt almost silly to be talking about it. Something which I really have no evidence for it. I'd be lying. However, if I said this was my primary reason, I still felt that this thing would be enraged if I so much as spoke of it. It's funny how a few certain words can remain hidden from your mind, no matter how blatant or obvious they are. One word that came to me the second night, lying there in the darkness alone, frightened, aware of the rotten change in atmosphere, a thickening of the air as if something had displaced it. I had heard the first casual twist of the bedsheets now, the first anxious increase in my heart rate at the realization that something was once again in the bottom bunk. That word, a word which had been sent into exile, filtered up through my consciousness, breaking free of all repression, gasping for air, screaming, etching, and carving itself into my mind. replaced by something far more hideous. A slow, rhythmic, raspy breathing heaved and escaped from the thing below. I could imagine his chest rising and fall with each sordid, wheezing, and gargled breath. I shuddered and hoped beyond all hope that it would leave without occurrences. The house lay as it had the previous night, in a thick blanket of darkness. Silence prevailed, all but for the reserved breath of my wet, as yet unseen, bunkmate. I lay there terrified. I just wanted this thing to go, to leave me alone. What did it want? And then something unmistakably chilling transpired. It moved. It moved in a way different from before. When it threw itself around in the bottom bunk, it seemed unrestrained, without purpose, almost animalistic. This movement was driven by awareness, with purpose, with a goal in mind. To that thing lying there in the darkness, a thing which seemed innocent, unterrorizing a young boy, calmly and nonchalantly sat up. Its labored breathing became louder, as now only a mattress and a few flimsy wood slats separated my body from the unearthly breath below. I lay there, my eyes filled with tears, a fear which mere words cannot relate to you or anyone else coursed through my veins. I would not have believed that this fear could have been heightened, but I was so wrong. I imagined that this thing would look like, sitting there, listening from below my mattress, hoping to clutch the slightest hint that I was awake. Imagination then turned into an unnerving reality. It began to touch the wooden slats which my mattress sat on. It seemed to caress them carefully, running what I would imagine to be fingers and hands across the surface of the wood. Then, with great force, it prodded angrily between the two slats into the mattress through the padding. It felt as though someone had viciously stuck their fingers into my side. I let out an almighty cry. The wheezing, shaking, and moving thing in the bunk below replied in a kind of violent vibrating the bunk, as it had done the night before. Small flakes of paint powdered under my blanket from the wall as the frame of the bed scraped along it, backwards and forwards. Once again, I was bathed in light, and there stood my mother, loving, caring as she always was, with a comforting hug and calming words which eventually subdued my hysteria. Of course, she asked what was wrong, but I could not say anything. I dared not say anything. I simply said one word over and over again. Nightmare. This pattern of events continued for weeks, if not months. Night after night, I would be awakened to the sound of rustling sheets. Each time I would scream to as not provide this abandoned abomination with time to prod and feel for me. With each cry, the bed would shake violently, stopping with the arrival of my mother. We'd spend the rest of the night at the bottom bunk, seemingly unaware of the sinister, torturing her son nightly. Along the way, I managed to feign illness a few times and come up with other less than truthful reasons for sleeping in my parents' bed. But more often than not, I would be alone for the first few hours of each night in that place. The room where the light from the outside did not sit right, along with that thing. With time, you can become desensitized to almost anything, no matter how horrific. I had come to realize, for whatever reason, this thing could not harm me when my mother was present. I'm sure the same would have been said for my father. But as loving as he was, waking him from his sleep was almost impossible. A few months, I had grown accustomed to the nightly visitor. Do not mistake this for some unearthly friendship. I detested the thing. I still feared it greatly, as I could almost sense its desire and personality, if you could call it that. One filled with the preserved and twisted hatred, longing for me, of perhaps all things. My greatest fears were realized in the winter. The days grew short. Longer nights merely provided this wretch with more opportunities. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother, a wonderfully kind and gentle woman, had deteriorated greatly since the death of my grandfather. My mother was trying her best to keep her in the community as long as possible. However, dementia is a cruel and degenerative illness, robbing a person of their memories one day at a time. Soon she recognized none of us, and it became clear that she would need to be moved from her house to a nursing home. Before she could be moved, my grandmother had a particularly difficult few nights, and my mother decided that she would stay with her. As much as I loved my grandmother and felt nothing but anguish at her illness, to this day I feel guilty that my first thought were not of her, but of what my nightly visitor would do should it become aware of my mother's absence. Her presence being one of the only things which I was sure was protecting me from the full horror of this thing's reach. I rushed home from school that day and immediately wrenched the bed sheets and mattress from the lower bunk, removing all the slats and placing an old desk, a chest of drawers, and some chairs which were kept in a cupboard where the bottom bunk used to be. I told my father I was making an office, which he found adorable, but I would be damned if I'd give that place a thing to sleep on one more night. As darkness approached, I lay there knowing my mother was not in the house. I did not know what to do. My only impulse was to sneak into her jewelry box and take a small family crucifix, which I had seen there before. While my family was not very religious, at that age I still believed in God and hoped that somehow this would protect me. Although fearful and anxious, while gripping the crucifix under my pillow tightly in one hand, sleep eventually came as I drifted off to dream. I hoped that I would awaken in the morning without incident. Unfortunately, that night was the most terrifying of all. I woke up gradually. The room was once again dark. As my eyes adjusted, I could gradually make out the window and the door and the walls, some toys on a shelf. Even to this day, I shudder to think about it, for there was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. The room felt lifeless but not empty. The nightly visitor, that unwelcome, wheezing, hate-filled thing was not in the bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Utter terror. I had shaken the very sound from my voice. I lay motionless. If I could not scream, I did not want to let it know I was awake. I had not seen it, only could feel it. It was obscured under my blanket. I could see its outline, and I could feel its presence, but I dared not look. The weight of it pressed down on the top of me, a sensation I will never forget. When I lay that hours passed, I did not exaggerate, laying there motionless in the darkness. I was every bit a scared and frightened young boy. If it had been during the summer months, it would have been light by then. The grass of winter is long and unrelenting. I knew it'd be hours before sunrise, a sunrise which I yearned for. I was a timid child by nature, but I reached a breaking point, a moment where I could wait no more, where I could survive under the intimidatingly deviant abomination no longer. Fear can sometimes wear you out, make you threaded bare, a shell of nerves, leaving only the slightest trace of you behind. I had to get out of the bed. Then I remembered my crucifix, my hand still laying underneath the pillow, but it was empty. I slowly moved my wrist around to find it, minimizing as best as I could the sound its vibrations caused, but it could not be found. I'd either knocked it off the tent bunk, or it had. I could not even bear to think of it, and take it from my hand. Without the crucifix, I had lost any sense of hope. Even at such a young age, you could be acutely aware of what death is, and intensely frightened of it. I knew I was going to die in that bed if I lay there, dormant, passive, doing nothing. I had to leave that room blind, but how? Should I leap from the bed and hope I can make it to the door? What if it's faster than me? Or should I slowly slip out of the top bunk, hoping not to disturb my uncanny bed follower? Realizing that it had not stirred when I moved, trying to find the crucifix, I began to have the strangest thought. What if it was asleep? It hadn't so much as breathed since I had woken up. Perhaps it was resting, believing that it had finally got me. It finally in my grasp. Or perhaps it was toying with me. After all, it had been doing just that for countless nights. And now with me under it, pinned against my mattress, and with no mother to protect me. Maybe it was holding off, savoring its victory until the last possible moment, like a wild animal savoring its prey. I tried to breathe as shallowly as possible. Mustering every ounce of courage I could, I reached over slowly with my right hand and began to peel the blanket off me. What I found under those covers almost stopped my heart. I did not see it, but as my hand moved the blanket, it brushed against something smooth and cold, something which felt unmistakably like a gaunt hand. I held my breath in terror, as I was sure it must have known that I was awake. Nothing. It did not stir. It felt dead. After a few moments, I placed my hand further down the blanket and felt a thin, poorly formed forearm. My confidence was almost twisted sense of curiosity grew as I moved further down to a disproportionately large bicep muscle. The arm was outstretched, laying across my chest, with a hand resting on my left shoulder, as if it had grabbed me in my sleep. realized that I would have to move this cadaverous appendage, even if I had so much hope to escape its grasp. For some reason, the feeling of torn, ragged clothing on the shoulder of the nighttime invader stopped me in my tracks. Fear once again swallowed in my stomach and my chest as I recoiled my hand in disgust at the touch of straggled, oily hair. I could not bring myself to touch its face, although I wonder to this very day what it have felt like. Dear God, it moved. It moved. It was subtle. Its grip on my shoulder and across my body strengthened. No tears came, but God, I wanted to cry. As its hand and arm slowly coiled around me, my right leg brushed along the cool wall which the bed lay against. All of that happened to be me in the room. It was the strangest. I realized that this clutching, rancid thing which drew great delight from violating a young boy's bed was not entirely on top of me. It was sticking out from the wall, like a spider string from its hair. Suddenly its grip moved from a slow tightening to a sudden squeeze. It had pulled and clawed at my clothes as if frightened that the opportunity would soon pass. I fought against it, but its emancipated arm was too strong for me. Its head rose up, writhing and contorting under the blanket. I now realized where it was taking me. Into the wall. I fought for my dear life. I cried, and suddenly my voice turned to me, yelling, screaming, but no one came. Then I realized why I was so eager to suddenly strike, why this thing to have me now. Through my window, the window that seemed to represent so much malice from the outside, streaked hope, the first rays of sunshine. I struggled further, knowing that if I could just hold on, it would soon be gone. As I fought for my life, the unearthly parasite shifted, slowly pulling itself up my chest, its head now poking out from under the blanket, wheezing, coughing, rasping. I do not remember its features. I simply remember its breath against my face, foul and as cold as ice. As the sun broke over the horizon, that dark place, that suffocating room of contempt was washed, bathed in sunlight. I passed out as its scrawny fingers encircled my neck, squeezing the very life from me. I awoke to my father offering to make me some breakfast. A wonderful sight indeed. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life until then. And now I moved the bed away from the wall, leaving behind the furniture I had believed would stop it from making the bed. Little did I think it would try to make it mine and me. Weeks passed without incident. Yet on one cold, frostbitten night, I woke to the sound of the furniture where the bunk beds used to be, vibrating violently. In a moment it passed. I lay there, sure I could hear a distant wheezing coming from deep within the wall, finally fading in the distance. I've never told anybody this story before. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bedsheets rustling in the night, or wheezing brought on by a common cold. And I certainly never sleep with my bed against a wall. Call it superstition if you will, but as I said, I cannot discount conventional explanations such as sleep paralysis, hallucinations, or that of an overactive imagination. But what I can say is this. The following year, I was given a larger room on the other side of the house, and my parents took that strangely suffocating, elongated place as their bedroom. They said they didn't need a large room, just one big enough for a bed and a few things. They lasted 10 days. We moved on the 11th. Hmm, should we continue, or should we move on to something else? That is the overwhelming question. I think we will end it here. I think we continue the story another day. Goodbye. And don't let the creatures grab you in the middle of the night.